Frank, and today we're going to learn about the Panamanian Independence movement and the Panama Canal.
So just to give a little recap for this season, those of you guys have been joining us, we are traveling around the Caribbean to different locations. Each week we're picking a different location. We're talking about one of our local alcohols from there, which would be rums, which we absolutely love, a drink made with those, and then some little history of the area.
Yeah, and we were supposed to go to the Bahamas tonight, but I searched all over Sarasota for Bahamian rum, and I even have one of my colleagues that is in the Bahamas trying to get me some, and the duty-free store didn't even have any.
We're making a little bit of bypass, and tonight we're going to talk about Panama.
Yeah, so when we think about Panama, the big thing there is the canal, and that is been there since it opened in 1914.
Gotcha.
And so we're looking over 100 years already that it's been in existence. So, but to get the Panama Canal built was the interesting thing. So the construction of it started in 1884 by the French, all right? And the guy who started that process was a guy named Fernando de Lesseps.
So he was a French guy. So the French are the ones who actually started. Now,
right.
The Panama Canal, the reason for it was, obviously we're back in 1914, and we've talked about this in previous lessons, but for people to take a boat from Florida to California, they'd have to go all the way down around the tip of South America.
Exactly. And they had built some railroads across the isthmus. And actually, the first transcontinental railroad in the Americas is across the Isthmus of Panama, because it's only 50 miles wide.
Right.
So that is a perfect run for it. But you still had to unload all those boats, put it on the train, travel it across, load it onto another set of boats. So the canal was the ideal thing for it, because they could just load up the boats and send them through.
Right.
So at the time, for the Panamanian Independence movement, that's going to start in 1903.
Okay.
All right. And at that time, Panama was part of Colombia.
Okay.
And Colombia had once been a much larger country, including Venezuela and Ecuador and all of that kind of stuff. But we saw them break up into those little things. And the only thing they really had left was Panama. Right. So with that same year, 1903, we get the Hay-Herran Treaty. And that treaty is between the United States and Colombia. And what it was going to do is it was going to grant the U.S. use of the Isthmus of Panama in exchange for financial compensation.
Okay.
Right.
So we really should have been the first backers for the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
And that was our thought going into it.
Right. So the French company, there was two French companies that attempted it, and they both went bankrupt. So our financial compensation was $40 million to that company and the shareholders of it to buy their stocks up and take over. Plus, we were going to give Colombia $10 million, and then they were going to get $250,000 a year annuity from us to as like our payment to use it and stuff.
Which in 1903 is pretty big money.
Yeah. So our Senate ratified it, but the Colombian Senate said no, because they were afraid they were going to lose their sovereignty, because they thought the Americans would just come in and take over not just Panama, but all of Colombia, which if we really looked at our history during that period of time,
that's what we were doing.
Yeah, so. America did a lot of invasions and took over governments throughout the Caribbean between 1900 and 1940. All right. So the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, he's the one who says, let's do this. Let's get the canal. And so he approved the rebellion. And so this guy named, what was his name? Buna Beria. He is one of the company that we're going to buy the stuff from.
Yeah. In France.
Well, he's actually in Panama.
Okay.
But so he's got this huge interest because he's a big stakeholder and he's the representative to the United States for this. And he goes and meets with the leader of one of the revolutions, because they've had like 4 or 5 revolutions to try and become independent, and the Colombians have always put it down.
Right.
So he writes them a check for $100,000 to buy supplies for the revolution, and I'm sure that $100,000 came from us.
Absolutely.
So it just got funneled through that, and they actually met at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. So it's happening in our country that they're making these plans. So he gives the okay for this, and so on November 3rd, the revolution begins.
In 1903.
In 1903.
Okay.
So we're talking a fast timeline here. And the Colombians had sent troops to the city of Colón. So the Panama Canal, at one end on the Caribbean side, the big city is Colón, and on the Pacific side, it's Balboa.
Gotcha.
All right. So they had all these troops there, and that's where the main railhead was. So,
and also that's where the Americans would be coming on that Caribbean side.
Now, the train line was administered already by the Americans, and the Americans had built it in 1856. But Teddy also sent a gunboat called the USS Nashville there to make sure that nobody messed with our trains. That was the excuse that they were using. And they sent a contingent of sailors and Marines ashore to reinforce the area there, so the Colombians couldn't use the trains to try and get to where the revolution was happening.
So the end result is we've got a very, very big hand in wanting Panama to become their own sovereign nation, so that we can make a deal with them for the canal.
Yeah, and what this is called is gunboat diplomacy. Yeah. And that goes on with us from like 1850 when we opened Japan to a little bit after this period of time. And the Nashville, it actually really got around the world. It was in China during the Boxer Rebellion. It was in the Mediterranean during World War I. It was in Boston, in the Caribbean at different times. It was part of our invasion of Mexico to take Veracruz in 1914. So it really had a big role in a lot of this stuff. There's a great movie called Sand Pebbles, which stars Steve McQueen, and it's about a gunboat, American gunboat named San Pablo, but it gets in China they call it the Pebbles. So it is really kind of a story that this ship could have been based on because of their time in the Boxer Rebellion, because that's when that movie takes place. So as I said, the rebellion begins on November 3rd, right? And then on November 6th, the United States recognizes Panama's independence, right? So 3 days later.
Yeah, we're like, hey, there they are.
Yep. And that was the big thing. When we got our recognition from France during the American Revolution, that's when it really took off for us. And you think about during the American Civil War, the Southerners were really trying to get France or Great Britain to acknowledge them as independent as well, and that never happened. So they could never get the same help that we did during our independence. And during this Panamanian independence, we are the ones that recognize them.
Gotcha.
So that treaty that we talked about, the initial one, it gets renamed the Hay Benua Varia Treaty, because he negotiates the treaty, and this gives the United States exclusive rights and permanent possession of the canal and the canal zone. So this is like a 10-mile wide area around the canal. And what Panama got is $10 million. Right? They paid the $40 million to the company, to those stockholders, and they began an annuity in 1912 of $250,000 a year. Right? So it's that fast that the war is really over. Now, the American Army Corps of Engineers is the one who builds the canal and oversees it. They start working in 1904, and they're finished by 1914.
So 10 years.
10 years. And then we see that we have given the canal back in 1999. All right. So, but as I said before, that first transcontinental railroad, it kind of went along the path of the canal,
which
right?
I think would also help supply the workers, supply machinery, supply everything to actually do the construction.
Exactly. So a little bit of the history of the canal, all right? So as I said, it started in 1882.
Yep.
Under the lead of Lecipe. And the reason why he got put in charge of it is because he built the Suez Canal, which goes between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean.
Right.
And that was another huge project, so they thought he could do it. The area by the Suez that they built the Suez Canal and Panama are two different places.
Right.
So on average, during the construction under French control, they had 200 workers a month die. All right. And they died from landslides, slippage of equipment. The biggest one was disease.
Exactly.
Right. So you had yellow fever, you had malaria.
You're in the tropical jungles. So.
Exactly. All of that led them to go bankrupt in 1889. Right. So they started another company, right, in 1894 to kind of try and sell what they had done to make money back. Right.
So for this new company, they were going to do the same thing. They were going to continue building where they had started and keep the canal going.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing that the American engineers did differently. They didn't try and make it like a river all the way through. Flooded a huge section of Panama and made a lake called Lake Gutan. And so it's really, you go into the lock system at Cologne, you go up 3 tiers of locks into the lake, you sail bulk of the way across the lake, and then you get into another lock system that takes you 3 tiers down into the Pacific. So that was the huge thing that the Americans figured out. Why build all of this stuff when we could just flood this area, turn it into a lake? And what that did too is it gave you space for ships to like decide whether they're going to
turn
go
around. Exactly.
Yeah. So they could do that. And one of the things that we see today is the Panama Canal is a huge cruise destination. And so some of them, they just take you through one set of locks and then they take you back through and go through. Other ones, they do repositioning ones where you go through the full canal. Right. All right. So again, Teddy Roosevelt intervenes. Now, the Colombians had what was called the 1,000-Day War going on, and it ends in 1902. All right, the year before all this stuff happens. And so they had been fighting a civil war for 3 years. And so that added to the ability of the Americans to just step in because
they were already weakened. They were already been through war.
Exactly. All right. So again, it's opened in 1914. So here's some fun facts about it. That first year, how many ships do you think went through the canal?
I would 200.
No, and that's a pretty good guess. It was 1,000 the first year.
Okay.
All right. In 2008, which was the last year I could find statistics for it, 14,702 ships go through the canal each year.
Wow.
Yeah. So, in the average time to go from the Pacific to the Caribbean or vice versa is 11 hours and 36 minutes. All right. To get, and that's through both sets of locks and through the lake. Yep. And it's considered to be one of the 7 modern wonders of the world. Yep. Right. And the other ones, if you want to know, are the Channel.
Yep.
Right.
Underneath from France to England.
The CN Tower in Toronto.
Okay.
Right. The Empire State Building. The Golden Gate Bridge.
Yep.
Now in the Netherlands, a lot of their country is below water level, the sea level. So they have this magnificent set of dikes and dams and all of this stuff. And it's called the Zunderzee. And then the other one is a dam in Brazil called the Itapu Dam. Mm-hmm. So those are the 7 of it. Now, when the Americans took over and started building the canal, in that 10-year period, there was about 5,600 deaths. So
it was still a very deadly thing to build.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So if we wanted to go through the canal on a ship, right, and this is part of the reason why the Americans gave over the Panama Canal to the Panamanians, right? The maximum length is 1,200 feet 9 inches, right? The maximum beam or width is 160 feet 9 inches. I don't know what the 9 inches means.
Yeah.
Right. And then it has a draft of 50 feet deep.
Okay.
Our modern aircraft carriers can't go through that. So they're
too big.
You're right. So they have them stationed in the different areas. And if they need to go between the Atlantic and the Pacific, they take them either around Africa or around there. So a couple other little statistics. The largest ship to ever go through it was the Neo-Panamax Triton.
Triton, okay.
Right? It's a container ship, and it was 1,211 feet long. So it actually, when it's in there, because they charge you by the length, so it actually is bigger than the lock.
Yeah. Because
they measure the stuff that's coming off the back of the ship. So,
but it can sit in the lock.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't they build ships specifically to be able to fit inside
right,
the
exactly. Yeah. Now, the most expensive voyage to go through it was $375,000 US.
Ooh.
And that was a cruise ship,
yeah.
the Norwegian Pearl going through, because they charged the cruise ships based on length and all that, but also they charged them a fee for each person on board the ship.
Sure.
All right. Now, the least expensive cost of going through the canals was a total of 36 cents.
Okay.
And this was done by Mr. Halliburton, and he swam through the locks, through the lake, and through the locks again. So I guess based on his size,
his length, it was 36 cents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, so that's a little bit of history about the canal and about Panamanian independence. And so tonight, the drink that we're drinking is the mojito, which I think is perfect for Panama.
Exactly. So,
and the rum that we're drinking tonight is Marti. All right. And they have 4 different kinds. They have Playa. The ones we got here are their extra strength and their Dorado. And they're in a state,
which we talked about one of those before. Now, an estate rum is a little bit, a little bit higher quality than just a standard rum because everything in that rum comes from one location.
Yeah. And so, we've talked about the proprietary yeast and stuff like that. On their bottles and on their marketing, they promote that their yeast comes from the pineapples that they also grow there, and that it grows on the skin of it, and that's where they got their proprietary yeast for it. And they also in our marketing say there are less than 5 grams of sugar in
the finished product.
In each liter. So that is kind of interesting too, because when we think of rum, we usually think of sweet.
Yep.
And so this isn't as sweet as some of the other rums we've tried.
Excellent. So hopefully you guys learned a little bit of a lesson tonight about Panama Canal, and the history behind it. For those of you on the internet, we will see you next week. For those of you guys who are here, we're going to have our trivia for the evening. So a good fun time if you guys can make it on down. What are we going to go to next week?
I think next week is week 10.
Yeah, so it's our final week of our trip.
So I think we're going to come back into the United States, and we're going to go and have one of our favorites, Papa Pilar.
Papa Pilar.
So we're going to end up in Key West.
Okay.
And have Papa Pilar rum.
Excellent. All right. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you guys so much for joining us in here, and we'll see you guys next week.
All right. Enjoy.